All right, so we got a number of questions, and we'll kind of tag team on this. I gave Mr. Dunbar all the tough questions.
Wait till you hear his questions.
And unfortunately, given the volume of questions that we got, I don't think we're going to be able to answer every single one. But if there are specific questions that you did submit and they were not addressed in the session, if you want to come up afterwards and ask particular questions, feel free to do so. Okay, the first question was, how do you painstakingly delve into the meanings and digest the content of the Word of God, including but not limited to the Baha'i writings, Quran, and Bible? So I think that's a very good question, because we are told in the writings that this concept of painstakingly delving into the writings is something that is necessary for us. And I think one of the requirements to that, to painstakingly dive into it, is actually chiseling out time. And that's difficult. And that can be painstaking sometimes. I had a fellowship and 2 kids, and trying to organize things for this, it required me to get up a couple hours earlier every morning and go to Starbucks and, be able to be involved in this. But I also found out that I didn't really need those 2 hours of extra sleep. So it was something that, could possibly be done on a future basis. The other thing that's important in this painstakingly going through the writings, I think, is picking out words or phrases that we don't understand, or we think we understand, and doing literature searches on those particular phrases. One of the things that we did in this Kitab-i-Ghan deepening that we had with the youth was we looked at the very first paragraph of the Kitab-i-Ghan, which says, "No man shall attain the shores of the ocean of true understanding except he be detached from all that is in heaven and on earth." Then it says, "Sanctify your souls, O ye peoples of the world, that haply ye may attain that station which God hath destined for you, and enter thus the tabernacle which, according to the dispensations of providence, have been raised in the firmament of the Bayan." Now, an interesting exercise that we did was we challenged ourselves to look at some of these words that are in there and try and find their meanings in the Bible and in the Quran and see how that enlightens our understanding of that particular verse. And so one of the youth picked this phrase, tabernacle, and decided to find out what this was about. And so he came back and he had a 4-page long essay that he had written as a 14-year-old with references, where he delved into the meaning of tabernacle and got loads of meanings from it. He found out that tabernacle was associated with the Holy of Holies, and found all kinds of references in the Baha'i writings to the Holy of Holies. He found out that man is separated from the Holy of Holies, where the presence of God dwells, by a veil. How many quotations are there in the Baha'i writings which talk about veil, being shut out as by a veil from him? The Ark of the Covenant was within the Holy of Holies. How many references do we see to Ark of the Covenant? The covering of the Ark of the Covenant was called the mercy seat. That's also a reference in the Baha'i writings. So all of these things that for someone who's Jewish or someone who is from a Christian background would read this passage and understand, for those of us who have grown up as Baha'is or perhaps not explored the parent faiths of our religion, it's a way to start. It's a way to start investigating these meanings. And it brings out a new level of meaning in all of the words of God that we read subsequently. So I think this is part of what painstaking means, is that we actually spend effort going through it. It should require an effort to do so.
The question is, how can we distinguish between laws and principles? Well, I think we have the lists, which is a good place to start, but you can also look in the dictionary to see the difference between those. The principles are all listed in that section of God Passes By that we were talking about, where Shoghi Effendi summarizes the principles proclaimed by Abdu'l-Baha during his visit to the West. The laws have been summarized also in the Kitab-i-Aqdas in the last chapter related to Baha'u'llah, where there's a summary of the Aqdas and a summary of the laws. And so you quite immediately get the idea. Laws are something that you're pretty clear whether you're obeying them or not. Principles are a little bit more slippery, you know. You could be violating the principles without realizing it by holding prejudices, for example, or false ideas. But the backbone of the world order of Baha'u'llah are the laws of the Kitab-i-Aqdas, the mother book of the Revelation. And we should familiarize ourselves with both those lists, and then I think you'll be able to distinguish more clearly if you have a problem between laws and principles.
The next question was, is the Rodwell translation of the Quran still the best? And I'm not sure whether it was ever labeled as the best, but it's a translation of the Quran that's quite poetic of all of the translations. You know, there are some that are quite literary translations, and those convey, you know, the literal intent of what those particular words mean. The Rodwell translation has much more of a flow to it. And I think when you look, the utility of Rodwell's translation comes in that if you look at how the Guardian translated the Quranic quotations, they would match somewhat Rodwell's translations more so than some of the others. So for Baha'is familiar with the English versions of Shoghi Effendi's translations, sometimes we can get those references more readily from the Rodwell translation than others. He referred to Sale's translation as well as quite a good one, and there have been other ones since. I mean, I think the best answer is probably to learn Arabic. It's something that I need to do, and I would love to do, and then we wouldn't have to deal with these issues.
The first written histories of mankind in summer, continuing to the questions of today's societies, are plagued by the same, generally speaking, fundamental questions. For example, the existence of a soul, life after death, good versus evil, relation between science and reality. Will our investigations move beyond these seemingly related questions? Well, I would hope that perhaps a more careful study of this discourses of Abdu'l-Baha, which deals with those questions specifically, or with the talks in general of Abdu'l-Baha, would answer those questions for the person that's asked this. Certainly he has many references to the existence of a soul. Likewise, he puts forth the proofs of immortality of human existence. He talks about both good and evil. And certainly there's a lot there, as we heard today, between science and reality. So I would say that the talks and examples of Abdu'l-Baha would be very close to addressing and resolving these long-lasting, as he's saying, pending questions that have been moving forward through society.
Can you further explain the meaning of through whom the letters B and E hath been joined and knit together, as used in the long obligatory prayer? I think further explanation means that I've already explained it, which I don't think I have, but this is a profound topic, and I usually say that when I'm trying to get out of trying to answer it. But in reality, it is a profound topic. The original Arabic version of this refers to the letters Kaf and Nun. And when you join those together, it becomes the verb of be. And if we look in the Quran, it says that creation was brought into being through the words be and it is. So these words be, being brought, joined and knit together into this, is the impulse that brings all of creation into being. In the scriptures, it refers to two forces interacting that bring about creation. One is an active force, and one is a recipient force. Okay? So one of the analogies that Abdul-Baha uses is that of a carpenter. A carpenter has in their mind an idea of what to build, a chair, for example. Now that in itself does not bring about reality. Creation is brought into being when that idea interacts with a passive force. Okay? And that passive force is a piece of wood, a stone, whatever it is. And the resultant creation of that depends, one, on the mind or the intellect, and the second upon the recipient. And depending on those two elements, it will have different forms. And I think this is a very interesting topic, because if we truly look into this topic, we will see that all of the principles and all of the laws in the Baha'i faith emanate from this one principle. This B and the E being joined in it together, this active and passive force joining together. And just to cite one example, just to make it a little more concrete, is one way we can think about it is that the B or the Mashiach or the will of God can be likened unto the faith of God. It's eternal, it's changeless. Baha'u'llah says this is the changeless faith of God, eternal in the past, eternal in the future. No change in it. It's limitless. Now that interacts with a passive force, which is our capacity. And when those two are joined and knit together, the mind of God with the capacity of creation, it gives birth to creation, which is the religion itself. And then as society develops and advances with this newfound understanding, its capacity changes, therefore the interaction brings about a new form, a new religion. So you can see that it's just one of the examples of how these two elements becoming joined and knit together is seen within the writings of the Baha'i faith.
What about Abdul-Baha talking about the lesser peace happening by the year 2000? Yes, we do have him talking about that. We don't have any tablets directly stating that. Certainly there was expectation because of the century of light and so many references that we would have had the lesser peace perhaps by that year, but it didn't happen. So I think you can attribute that to the will of God and maybe a little bit to our slowness of activities. I don't know. We have to wait and see. The forces of the world have to line themselves up in such a way, because the lesser peace requires the fixing of the frontiers of all of the countries for once and for all. And we know from the prophecies of the Old Testament and also from the Baha'i writings that, as Baha'u'llah says, "O Jerusalem, spread thy skirt." Israel has to expand to be a greater country than it is. It's the center of the future capital of the world, so to speak. Haifa is the very center, heart center, nerve center of the Baha'i civilization. So maybe there'll be some more activities before we see the lesser peace emerge.
This question says, we seem to have difficulties in finding receptive populations. Would you comment on this? Thank you. I think there are a couple ways of looking at this. One of them is that we live in a very materialistic society. And as such, people's priorities are not necessarily aligned in the correct orientation. And as such, people might be less receptive to the revelation of Baha'u'llah. But I think one of the things we have to think about is perhaps it's not their receptivity that's the issue. Perhaps we play a role in not being able to present it in a manner necessary for them to be receptive to it. Like Mr. Dunbar was saying, we can say the principles and we believe in X, Y, and Z, or we can say it in a manner that is enticing, that makes it something, a fodder for conversation. And that's up to us. I think talking about the Christian communities and the Muslim communities that we interact with in our daily discourse on the Baha'i faith, having familiarity with their scriptures is something that's essential. And if we don't have that familiarity, then that quality of interaction is going to be limited, and they're going to be seen as not a receptive community. So I think a lot of the burden rests on us rather than on trying to find a small group of people.
Question addressed to me: are you writing another book? If so, what is the theme? Thank you. That's very encouraging. Thank you, friends. Actually, I don't usually write books. I give talks. So then I get transcripts transcribed of the talks and sometimes edit those together. But I think, looks like we might see this Discourse of Abdu'l-Baha becoming a small book, just from the point of view that may be a little less frightening than Promulgation of Universal Peace, and kind of coax the people into a more careful study of the Master's talks.
When I hear a Baha'i lies and or backbites often, I try to stay away from her/him as much as possible. My excuse is the last part of the hidden words that is written on the other side of this paper. Am I right or wrong? And the quotation is, "O friend, in the garden of thy heart, plant not but the rose of love, and from the nightingale of affection and desire, loosen not thy hold. Treasure the companionship of the righteous, and eschew all fellowship with the ungodly." I came across a passage in Gleanings from the Writings of Baha'u'llah that I thought was quite illuminating in this regard. In it, Baha'u'llah praises and asks for his life to be a sacrifice for those who wish him ill or do him wrong. And he explains why. And this was very helpful for me, because there are certain people that it's just very difficult to see that light of Baha'u'llah within them. It's there somewhere. We're promised it's there, but it can be very difficult, and they make it very difficult to show it. And this was really helpful because in it, and I'm paraphrasing it, in it Baha'u'llah states that if it were not for these people and the bad things that they do and the evils that they do, he said, how would God's name, the forgiving, be made manifest? If there was nobody doing anything bad, there'd be no forgiveness, and the world would be deprived of knowing that name of God, the forgiver. He said, if it were not for the bad things that people do, and again I'm paraphrasing, he said, how would God's name, the concealer of the sins of the world, be made manifest? So I thought this was kind of an enlightening way to see it, because the evil things that other people do, or the bad things that people do, actually present a wonderful opportunity to be able to manifest within our own heart those names of God, so long as we are forgiving and we're overlooking their faults. There was an interesting passage from one of the writings of Abdu'l-Baha, published in Star of the West, where he said that friendship should be of the following kinds. You should be friends with these kinds of people. Either they improve your character, or you improve their character. And hopefully you both improve each other's character. But if neither one of those is happening, maybe it's best to distance oneself.
can you trace how the Baha'i community has been in a learning mode prior to 5 years ago? How do we know what we've learned? Well, I think the learning mode concept has been going on for more than 5 years. It dates way back from the inception of this new series of plans. It's about 15 years ago now, where certain steps are taken, and then the result of them is examined. It's the whole question of the process of acting and then meditating and reviewing and taking new actions, deciding if there's an adjustment to be made. On the world stage, the House of Justice has sometimes posed questions that it gets answers for from around the world. And those answers may not be the ones that your reflection meeting might have come up with. And the House of Justice has shared those, and that's been the means of a unified action throughout the world. How do we know what we've learned? It's a kind of an enigmatic question, isn't it, in a sense? I think you can read the messages of the House of Justice and find out whether you've understood them or not, how they apply to where you live. Because that's where the real concentrated guidance rests, the 28th of December letter and the Rizwan 2010, particularly those two messages need to be revisited and thought about a great deal. I was there for the writing of the 2010 message. I stepped down from the House at Nowruz when we tallied the votes for the new members. And I remember one pilgrim season, one of the pilgrims, when we were speaking at the Pilgrim House, asked, she says, I know the House of Justice writes the Rizwan messages, but what else does it do? Now, there were enough Baha'is like you and some of the staff that they all thought that was very funny. Had a good laugh about it. And I couldn't really help myself. I said to the lady, do you think it's easy to write the Rizwan message? Or I could have said, we have to rush to get it finished in a year. But I didn't. But the Rizwan message really is a phenomena in itself. Of all the messages that the House wrote during the years that I served on it, we would have an initial consultation, just open, where all the members would contribute ideas that they thought what should be emphasized or what should appear within the Rizwan message this year. And all of us would take notes of everybody. There wasn't a secretary in that sense. In the chairmanship of the House rotates, friends, week by week in alphabetical order of last names. So that's constantly rotating. We don't have a fixed chairman, but we have somebody to organize the meeting, in a sense to direct the meeting, so that we can speak progressively one to the other. And then we'd assign that, say, maybe one or two members to write the first draft of the Rizwan message, based on the consultation that we'd had, based on the caveats, because a member would present his ideas and somebody else would reaffirm that idea or expand on it, or say, yes, but with a word of caution, I think we should be careful that we don't do this or that. And so there was a general kind of consensus and understanding going on as the consultation, as the new members, the next member to speak added another dimension to the message. And then so there was a draft made, and the draft would come back, and the House of Justice would hear it read out in the chamber. And then we'd all have copies, and then we'd go general sense of the message, what was the impression of each of the members, and then what changes, what alterations would you suggest for the whole message as a whole, for its approach. And then we went to the specific paragraphs in the light of whatever had been discussed, and made comments about the paragraphs and the order of the paragraphs and the content of the paragraphs, and finally to the sentences and the adjusting and choice, correction of verbs and adjectives and nouns, whatever it was. Maybe he said the first sentence of this paragraph looks like it's better as the last sentence of this paragraph. Or this paragraph looks to me like a finale to the whole message. And so on. So again, the ideas were taken and they went out, and the message, another draft came back. And generally there would be 8 rounds, 7, 8 rounds of for the message. So really getting it, honing it down, to where everybody's happy with it, nobody has any more problems with it. And then you get it. And then the problem is yours to understand it all and absorb it.
We need to read it 19 times.
As a start, yeah, that's good. Okay.
Can you please provide guidance regarding the teachings about begging and how we as Baha'is should respond to those who we see in our communities who are on sidewalks at intersections asking for money? The dear Master was always so generous to the poor, giving them money. How are we to apply our writings to these situations? There's one of the hidden words that I was sharing with my son. He was 5 years old. And I was talking about the responsibility of those who are wealthy for those who have none, who are poor. And I had to explain to my son what poverty meant. How there are some people who don't have a home. There are some people who don't have the next meal available to them. And I was getting into explaining this when I looked to the side, through the side of my head, and I saw his face, and tears were coming down his face. He was very affected by it. And so he rushed to his piggy bank, he opened it up, and he took out his money. He said, "This is for the fund, and this is for the poor people." And he's still very concerned with the poor people. And so he volunteers time to be able to help out. So I think it's something that is useful to instill within ourselves and within our children, because this is something that Abdu'l-Baha was very concerned with. And I actually had this very same question myself. I don't know who wrote it, but it's the same question I had. And I read a book called, I think it's called 9 Years in Akka. Has anyone read that book?
Yes.
Phenomenal account. It's one of the secretaries of Abdu'l-Baha, who writes about his 9 years, eventually became a physician. He wrote about his 9 years that he spent in Akka and his observations of the Master. It's phenomenal. It talks about how Abdu'l-Baha would reveal his tablets. He wouldn't just say tablets to someone else to write down, but as he was dictating a tablet in Farsi, he would be writing another tablet in Turkish at the same time. If you've ever tried to do that, I tried that myself. I tried to have a conversation with my wife about what I did yesterday and write down what I did today. That's it. And I couldn't do it. It's impossible. And it's one of the miracles of the Baha'i faith is to look at how Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha would reveal these tablets. And phenomenal stories about how they were delivered as well that we haven't gotten into. But in it, Abdu'l-Baha explains, or in it, the secretary of Abdu'l-Baha explained the method by which Abdu'l-Baha would give money to the poor. First of all, he wouldn't give it to children. He did not want to develop within children the habit of begging, but he would see to it that they were taken care of. And he'd have a line of people who were waiting to receive the money, and Abdu'l-Baha would go one by one and press the coin into their hand. And when he was aware of a job that was available, he would tell them about it and tell them to go check it out and try and be involved in this position. And if he found out that they hadn't done so, he wouldn't give them the additional money. That it wasn't a process of giving money and feeling good about it, and now I'm happy I gave $1 to someone in the street and this is good. The problem is, in society today, is that money goes somewhere. And unfortunately, it might go to areas in which we would not be happy for that money to go towards. And perhaps there are other ways, as Baha'is, that we can be involved in supporting those who are poor and in need, and be able to lift them up to a position where they're able to provide to society, which is something that Baha'u'llah calls for in the Hidden Words. So for the person who asked that question, forever else, I would thoroughly encourage reading that account in Memories of 9 Years in Akka.
Supplementing that answer from the point of view of another scene of Abdu'l-Baha seated, dictating 4, sometimes 5 tablets with 5 secretaries around him, writing himself a tablet in his lap, and then giving the first verse in, say, Persian to the first secretary, and then while they were writing, giving the first verse to a tablet in Arabic to the next one, and then another Persian and Turkish, and all around in the circle. And then, as he was writing, giving the second sentence to the first secretary, and the second sentence to the... and writing cohesive tablets that way, but saving time by having a circle of them so he didn't have to wait for anybody to finish writing. Can you imagine? Would you like to try to do that sometime? What is the galaxy of Baha'i Immortals, and where can you read about it? Well, the galaxy of Baha'i Immortals seems to consist of the souls of those souls that Shoghi Effendi has identified as being part of the galaxy of Baha'i Immortals in several of his messages. One particular one is in Messages to the Baha'i World. And I don't think it was in the original publication. It's in the one that has the supplementary added messages to it, which is the normal Messages to the Baha'i World that is available now. You look up, or if you've got Ocean or one of these search programs, you look up Galaxy and you should come right up with it.
Where has competition between people originated? And why is it so embedded in our society? I think competition, like most things, can go both ways. There's good competition. I like competition. If all sports teams ended in a tie, I think there would be very few spectators. That competition is something that can drive us to excel. Competition with ourselves, to try and be able to run a marathon. You know, there's progress that's made from that. There's competition with ourselves to try and see whether we can devote extra time to studying the writings. Shoghi Effendi says that we should vie with one another in our service to the cause. So competition can have a positive, beneficial aspect in society. On the other hand, the kind of competition that we see in society today can be quite detrimental. What we understand as competition is oftentimes only having the goal in mind at whatever expense. And as Baha'is, we have to keep that in mind. That it's not trying to get to the goal at the expense of others, but it's trying to strive hard to get there and giving it all that we've got as individuals. So I think there's a subtlety to it. Where does it originate? I think it's within our nature as individuals. You know, there's a lot of things that are inherent in our nature. We're told in the Baha'i writings that we have two aspects. We have a divine side and we have a satanic side, a human side, an animal side. And that the goal in life is one in which we try and subdue that animalistic side and bring out the divine side. And we're told in the writings that if it's not for our connection with the Word of God, we would gravitate towards that of erring. We would be like plants that grow in a garden without direction. We become weeds. And it requires a gardener to come in and set them straight and make them in nice rows and make it pretty and be able to have the most beautiful flowers that come from that. So I think there's a lot of things in our human nature that we have to try and suppress in order to bring out the divine side.
Someone has asked about the best way to use the compilation of Shoghi Effendi's writings cited in Forces of Our Time. I think there's various ways to do it. I compiled those things in the second section of this is a book that I wrote myself some years ago. The second section where you could read in date order the various quotations that I found where Shoghi Effendi referred to the various forces, both forces of good and forces of evil, in a way that you could follow the development of his thought and what he was saying about it through his whole ministry. So that's very useful to do and see what you can make of it. Parallel to that, the book itself, the first half of the book, is an attempt to use, in a useful way, those quotations to develop the theme and see it in a wholeness. And while I'm not totally satisfied with it, it is one representation of a way you could use those quotations. And that formed the basis of a number of courses and lectures and things. While we're thinking about the subject, it's one that doesn't get attended to a lot, but it helps consolidate our idea of the continuity and connection between all these stages of the faith. And also, why is it that it's so difficult to teach the cause in the world at the present time? Identifying materialism as the leading force of darkness, an enemy of the cause in the world.
If appropriate, please explain arc of descent and ascent. Sure. There's a...
He's just waiting for you to answer that.
So I think we briefly got into this idea of arc of descent. Okay? The arc of descent is taking from the divine and bringing about creation. The first two stages of which are this idea of Mashiach and Iradeh, the B and the E being joined and knit together. So those are the first two stages. In the writings it talks about 7 stages. Okay? There are 7 stages in which creation is brought about into being. And there are many beautiful analogies that are taken from that and mystical understandings and so forth. So it's the way in which the divine becomes created in a form. That's the arc of descent. There's also an arc of ascent, in which we as individuals, as created beings, try to go back towards being divine. And one of the ways this is described is in the 7 valleys. 7 steps to going back towards being the divine. The last step of which, in this process, is annihilation. Right? Is the annihilation of oneself, one's ego. So that when one is annihilated, the final step, all that rests within us is the divine will itself. This is the secret behind the saying, servitude is a substance, the essence of which is divinity. That's quoted by Abdul Baha'i. That if we allow ourselves to manifest this process of moving in the direction of becoming divine, the final step of which is nothing is seen within us but the divine itself. the reflection of the light of God, the perfect polished mirror reflecting that light perfectly to humanity. So the arc of descent is one where we go from divine to creation. The arc of ascent is one where we go from creation to becoming divine. Is that right?
No comment. Mr. Dunbar, could you please talk to us about what Shoghi Effendi foretold about the year 2044? Thank you. That's my answer. Huh? I'm sorry, I don't know any reference in the writings to 2044 on the part of Shoghi Effendi. If you show me the quotation, maybe I would have something to say, but I don't know what the reference is to.
My question concerns the hidden words. Three-part question. Is that allowed?
What was the question?
It's a three-part question concerning the hidden words. I think this person was a physician.
Because you can't read the writing, right?
Yeah, he's had a lot of experience as a doctor with this.
Personal experience, yeah. In particular, what, if any, is the significance of the title? The hidden words was originally, if I remember correctly, referred to as the Book of Fatima. Now, Fatima was the daughter of Muhammad. And according to Shia tradition, upon the passing of Muhammad, there are various accounts of it, but the angel Gabriel came and revealed revelation to Fatima to console her. And this book was called the Book of Fatima. And it was never recorded, we don't have any version of it. But according to traditions, in the time of the end, the Mahdi was supposed to reveal this book. So this is the spiritual return of this book, the Book of Fatima. And I think the hidden words is probably a reference to this title as well, that these words were hidden, we didn't have access to it, and now Baha'u'llah has given us access to it. Also, there are, any of the words of God could be considered the hidden words in a sense, that they all have so many meanings. Baha'u'llah refers to himself as the most manifest of the manifest and the most hidden of the hidden. And one time it's so obvious, but another time it's so mysterious. Does it relate to the verse in Daniel in the Old Testament where he is told that the books are unsealed? I don't believe so. I think that's primarily a reference to the Kitab-i-Ghan itself. And it says, the book was written in Baghdad before Baha'u'llah announced his position. Was he not writing to Muslims? Was he referring or relating to verses in the Quran or scriptures from other manifestations? Yes.
That's impressive. I like that. Would Mr. Dunbar be willing to share his experiences developing discipline in reading the writings systematically and how this may have evolved over the years? How did you get your questions answered and resolve apparent contradictions in the writings? Big question. This is a long time coming. You make your attempts over the years, and I've tried to study the writings, at least read everything, the compilations that I made of items from Shoghi Effendi's writings, I made before computers were on the scene. So I would start at the beginning of Shoghi Effendi's opus and read all the way to 1957 and pull out the quotations I wanted. And I did that a number of times to build up something called the vision of the future, which are the progressive stages of the development of the cause as seen in the writings of the Guardian, projected into the future. Or you say you want all the references of Shoghi Effendi to divine civilization, so you read and pull all those out. But in the process you'll notice other things. So I noticed also this question of forces and began compiling those out. And I would keep them on separate notebooks. Also then I would put quotes on cards or on sheets of paper, written, with a source for where they were, and I'd put them in a pile. Then eventually I get to a stage where I take these various quotations, whatever they were, and read them and start to try to intuit some structure to it. In the case of then the vision of the future, it was the order in which those various stages were set forth in the writings, and then adding the quotations for each stage to that stage until I had a compilation and the basis for a work on that. And Forces of Light and Darkness, originally, which was the original title for Forces of Our Time, was the same process, working on something on life after death in the same way, one quotation per sheet that eventually you place in different ways of significance, the relationship of one to another, and then write the interface, if you will, between the various quotations. So I think that's about all I could say about that. Apparent contradictions, how do you resolve apparent contradictions in the faith? Of course, we do occasionally run across those. There is a quotation from the Guardian, and he says that the truths of the faith are like the lines on a globe, they reach around to apparently the opposite position. But if you read the writings and study the meanings of the text, you see the connecting lines between these apparently opposite points. I don't think of a particular example right now, but you no doubt have seen things that seem to suggest one thing on the one hand and another on the other. And then you need to tease out the connecting tissues between them. For instance, this question of begging. I don't see Abdu'l-Baha giving to beggars anyplace. He would offer money to the poor. He would give money to the poor. He gave to the men in the Bowery. He gave on Friday to the people that would gather in his courtyard. But that isn't the mendicant on the corner with as far as I know. Do you remember any example of that? I think it was more disciplined in that point. He had a line of all kinds of people there on Friday in the courtyard to give a coin to. And there was one lively fellow who positioned himself at the beginning of the line, and Abdu'l-Baha gave him a coin. And when he came to the end of the line, there was the man at the end of it. He'd run around the back of the whole group and gone to the... Shameless, huh? So Abdu'l-Baha looks at him and he says to him, I've given you a coin already. And the man grabbed Abdu'l-Baha's hand and bit it.
Oh, you're kidding.
And Abdu'l-Baha said, put your hands forward. And the man stuck out his hands, and Abdu'l-Baha filled them together and took the bag of coins and poured a whole pile of coins into his hand. And he said, before I treated you as a friend, but now that I see you're my enemy, other rules come into play. Mysterious, huh?
I'd just like to add a little bit more to how Mr. Dunbar studies. I think one of the one of the interesting things that he does and useful things that he does is he invites others to participate with him. I remember at the Baha'i World Center, he would start with a letter from Shoghi Effendi. The unfoldment of world civilization was the first one that you showed me, and with a small group of people, we would start going through it. And he would identify words that were challenging. What does world civilization mean? Are there other passages in the writings that talk about world civilization? And then we had to go back and create compilations on these things and find out all of the references in Shoghi Effendi's writings to world civilization until we had an understanding of what that meant. And so that kind of discipline of going through things that we're not quite clear on was something that was definitely instilled into me. This is a question regarding supporting community development in an inner city neighborhood. In this neighborhood, junior youth groups have been started. I have visited parents along with animators. I pray to deepen my relationship with the community in the inner city neighborhood in any way I can. I am not sure how else to do this, other than visit parents. I wonder whether to volunteer. I don't know how to proceed. Neither do I. But I will share a story of an individual who I'm very impressed with. In the city of Baltimore, which I don't know if you've seen The Wire, if you've had that experience, or whether you visited it personally, they have some inner city neighborhoods in Baltimore. And my friend, who was a medical student at Johns Hopkins University, and eventually went on to do his residency in ophthalmology there, he decided to live in the inner city. He's half white, half Persian like myself. And he bought a house, quite cheaply, in a corner that whenever he would walk there, the police officers initially would pull over and ask what he's doing there in that neighborhood. And he said, I live here. And they didn't believe him. And they told him that he lived in the second worst corner in all of Baltimore City, as far as drug traffic, as far as shootings and all of these things. This is where he'd chosen to live. And what he did was he started to make friends with his neighbors. He started devotional activities. He started children's classes. He started junior youth groups. And everyone in Baltimore City, the Baha'is, started rallying around his efforts, to the point that on his block, 2 families became Baha'is. An area of Baltimore that had not been penetrated by Baha'is in a long time. But through his love, through his compassion, through his devotion to service, and to fulfilling the 5-year plan, he felt moved to make this happen. And I remember visiting him. And as I pulled up on the corner where he lived, I got out and I was offered all kinds of things by people. Didn't know quite what they were, but sounded interesting. And I went inside his house and I started talking to him about it. And he was saying, yes, I find it difficult to go out at night. It's not the safest thing to do, but the effects of teaching the faith here are having quite a lot of impact in the community. I said, but isn't it dangerous? And he said, yeah. He said one morning he woke up, he opened his door, and there was a man who had been shot who was lying on his doorstep. And so he was a physician, so he was able to help the guy out. And as I was over there talking to him, out the window I saw 2 individuals chasing each other, one with a gun behind the other, and I heard the gunfire of the weapon going off. And we both ducked to the ground. And then the police cars came and cleaned it up and everything. But that was the conditions that he was living in. And what an example of sacrificing one's comforts in order to meet a desperate need of the Baha'i faith and the Baha'i community. And his efforts alone, that one effort of moving to that particular community, brought about such racial diversity and economic diversity to the Baha'i community that our community had not seen in ages. And this was all through the efforts of one individual to put themselves in an uncomfortable situation and be able to render that kind of service to society.
I think that's a nice note to end on, friends. We're at 5 o'clock, and we want to thank you all for your kind attention. Appreciate it.